it is still a form of digital colonialism. The governance model that produced those AI models are still controlled with the values of Silicon Valley or of Beijing. Then you have not democratized power. You have just distributed the terminals and the data extraction facilities of a centralized authority instead of putting your citizens, humans, in the loop of AI. We need to take those out and put AI into the loop of humanity.
Can we really trust private companies to democratize AI? The India AI Impact Summit is leaning in hard on concepts that are important, but also often co-opted. So in partnership with AI Now and the Aapti Institute, we've produced a series of interviews with some incredible people who live and breathe substance analysis and meaningful action into these concepts. In this interview, I am talking with Audrey Tang about democratization. Audrey Tang is a Taiwanese politician and free software programmer, and she served as the first Minister of Digital Affairs of Taiwan. She's an advocate for digital democracy and collaborative governance using technology to enhance civic participation and has lots of opinions about the role AI might play in democratization. So let's get into it.
Hello, I am Audrey Tang. I am Taiwan's founding Minister of Digital Affairs and Right Livelihood Laureate for advancing the social use of digital technology to empower citizens, renew democracy, and heal divides.
Beautiful. So when you think about nation states considering AI and then considering it kind of alongside or in integrated ways with democracy, like what do you think they should be asking? How do you think they should be approaching that question of sort of AI and democracy?
Yeah, so I was just reading this new DeepMind paper called Distributional AGI Safety. Are you aware of that paper?
I
It's
have
a really
seen the
nice one.
headline, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, okay, you have seen the
Yeah.
headline. Yes, and I think it's a really good distillation of what we talked about last time in Barcelona,
Mm.
which is quite unlikely actually for superintelligence to emerge through a singleton recursively improving itself from the current situation of multiple sub AGI agents, each using tools and also using each other as sometimes tools, sometimes collaborators, sometimes adversaries. It is far easier to imagine a situation where the superintelligence emerges from the real-time interaction of multiple sub-AGI agents, kind of emerging superintelligence. And in this scenario, then it is not about how to convince a super brain to not harm humanity, which was the original kind of less wrong-ish conversation was about, right? But this time, it is much easier to imagine for policymakers because instead of a kind of eschatological conversation, we should instead have a conversation of AI as a medium for social coordination and also AI as actors, social actors in that coordination. So a frame that I prefer then is how can AI increase the bandwidth of human listening and agency? Because then it puts AI within the fabric of society, of the superintelligence that we already are, and increase the human superintelligence too, in a way that's like a symbiogenesis.
So what I'm hearing you say is that if I'm running a country and I want to do so democratically and I want to have a lively democracy, that AI can play a role that makes it easier for me to have a better sense broadly about what people want, what they're thinking, how they're prioritizing different things, and how basically be more efficient in having that influence my own policy priorities and decision making.
That's
Yeah, yeah.
correct. I think it also helps to think of the existing way, like high frequency trading, like things that happened before, that there's this bunch of automated systems that outthink or faster than human governance can work, and how we as a human society manage to put some caps through checks and balances, audits, and robustness guarantees, proof of stake, and things like that. And so think about democracy currently as a low bandwidth technology. We vote once every few years. That's a very thin streams of data. And there's now a lot of ways like deepfake scams, fraudsters, and so on that taps into this vacuum of human coordination and try to take over to convince people of things that are not to their best interest. Anything from organized crimes to people who planning the top-down like takeover of smaller, weaker states through fraud are using AI to do that. And we simply cannot fight such adversarial use of AI using just existing human coordination network. So it is almost a necessity to upgrade our coordinated defense, also using technology, because the attackers are not going to stop. The organized crime are not going to stop if all the nations participating in the summit sign a treaty against organized fraud online.
Yeah. So, do you think the summit's framing around equitable distribution of compute and access to technologies is, I don't know, do you think it makes sense as a priority or a policy focus?
Well, I think it's a necessary condition, right? Taiwan, after all, is the home to the original personal computing revolution. And personal computing, of course, relies on a computer at every desktop, to paraphrase Bill Gates or to quote. And I think treating the necessary condition as the sole focus is
Mhm.
quite dangerous,
Mm.
right? Because if you only have the local compute, if you only have the local access to compute, then it is still a form of digital colonialism, right? So a country has powerful servers, chips made in Taiwan, but the model, I mean, both the AI model, but also the governance model that produce those AI model are still controlled with the values of Silicon Valley or of Beijing. Then you have not democratized power.
Mhm.
You have just distributed the terminals and the data extraction facilities of a centralized authority. Actually, maybe even worse, because without decentralized compute, there's no way to collect that much real-time data. If you just distribute compute and you give up the local alignment of such compute, you give up the sovereignty of alignment. It may look like you have data sovereignty or compute sovereignty, but the sovereignty of alignment is gone. And so I think instead of putting your citizens, humans, in the loop of AI, we need to take those out and put AI into the human loop, into the loop of humanity.
I really like that. If that's necessary but insufficient, what are the other components that would complete the sort of project that you're describing?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we need a very short feedback loop from the local harms being detected to a undeniable benchmark, making those harms seen and also unequivocally enforceable if there's going to be some flaw. For example, for a long time, I think for most of this year, many countries have seen over reliance on synthetic intimacy. But because for most countries, these remain anecdotal, that there really is no way to both preserve their privacy and also make a undeniable benchmark to show that sycophancy is bad enough, but synthetic intimacy is actually taking over people's minds, including young people, but also vulnerable people. Even if there's some independent assessment, evals, and so on published, none of them achieve the same visibility as, for example, the ozone is being depleted,
Mm.
right? So it doesn't lead to anything remotely resembling the Montreal Protocol,
Mhm.
right? So I think at the bare minimum, there needs to be a undeniable common knowledge so that people can see what emerging harms are actually happening, and in a way that a country can simply say, okay, this is committing what's called epistemic injustice. It is colonizing our way of relating, of being. And so unless a foreign model stops causing such harm, or even better, if a foreign model can help to repair some of those harms, ozone is healing, last I checked. So unless this is happening, we're not going to let them enter into our work stream, into our education stream, or whatever other stream. So I think that the point here is that we should stop thinking about AI as kind of new electricity, some kind of commodity like oil or something that simply needs to be piped to more people. Actually, that also leads to chemical pollution. That also leads to other things, right? So it's not pure utility, distilled utility. There's a lot of pollutants, and the pollutants are not going to go away unless people start measuring it.
Mhm.
I once said that the social media polarization per minute can also be abbreviated as the
PPM.
ppm. And if we start measuring that as we did the CO2 ppm, then things will be much, much better because what's measured gets improved.
I want to talk a little bit with you about why we're seeing such strong alignment in non democratic states with AI, and kind of if you can describe a little bit about what your observations are on why that might be and sort of what the antidote to that might be.
Well, last time we spoke, I mentioned that most imaginations of AI, whether narrow or general, are utilitarian in nature. which means to achieve a result and without caring too much about how you got there, right? So the end justifies the means. That's utilitarianism. And so this is quite an apt description of authoritarianism also. So in a sense that they run on the same meta-ethic backbone because the monolithic efficiency mirrors the authoritarian structures and also mirrors the story that authoritarians tell to their citizens or to their subjects when it comes to justifying that. Usually it says, the whole of society, whole of nation, mobilization of research, development, implementation, all vertically integrated is far more efficient. That is utilitarian logic, right? I think if we embrace the distributional view, though, of AI can absolutely strengthen democracy because we can design the measures so that monopoly is not seen as a good thing, but rather as something that forecloses future possibilities. So any market regulator understand monopolies are quite efficient
For a
within it,
time.
and also within the for a time for product market fits, and then it reshape its own environment. It does regulatory capture and many other things so that it forecloses new innovations and just the local optimum is held there. Well, not forever, but at least for a couple of generations, right? So that's how monopolies work. So if we think of this narrative, then I think mostly people in both democracies and the authoritarian countries that have at least some exposure to markets understand that AI can be high frequency, but it should not, through collusion and monopoly and market capture, to foreclose any future possibility because new emergent issues happen all the time. If a authoritarian structure is optimized this particular way, and then the coronavirus mutates, that's not even a metaphor. It sometimes happens. And then the old way of doubling down on the top-down, take-down, lockdown, shutdown mechanisms is suddenly actually working at odds with reality. And this is usually what happens if you over optimize for something. I wouldn't go as far to say that in politics, premature optimization is the root of all evil, as it is in computer science. But I think the general argument can be made against premature optimization, even in authoritarian countries for AI.
Interesting. I feel like, I mean, one thing I can sense from even people that are working in democratic environments, there is a fear of decentralization, like a control instinct kicks in of, maybe bad actors will get access to technology if it's made open, or decentralizing the actors means too many people will be working on too many things at one time, and who knows what will happen. How do you engage people who are concerned about decentralization or openness or the kind of creative use of these technologies by lots of different people in ways we can't expect?
Well, I think people hear decentralization and they think like individualistic libertarianism, which is really quite chaotic and quite dangerous. So, like all against all. And even if it's currently kind of check and balanced, as long as one single individual, a lone wolf, gains a nuke or something like that, and then it causes maximal damage, right? So, as long as you have something offense dominant, you would naturally think the power should not be on individuals because some individuals may go haywire. On the other hand, though, mostly when people actually look at how commons are governed in a, I wouldn't call it decentralized, but rather in a plural way. It is not at a unit of individuals. Rather, it's almost always at a hyperlocal community. So I think the main insight, as Eleanor Ostrom long ago articulated, is that people closest to the pain, to the danger, are actually already quite empowered to not just diagnose, but also overcome the danger. So the closer the wisdom is at the edge, the easier for you to overcome unexpected threats. The more centralized you are, the more innovators at the edge are disempowered, the more brittle it is for the entire ecosystem. Although, of course, you can perfectly defend against the enumerated 500 threats on your table. That also means you lose the sense of the 501st threat because you disempower the local intelligence. And that is why the internet as a artifact is a much more resilient design than any centralized network. And that is because it allows for permissionless innovation. But permissionless doesn't mean that one end can unilaterally dominate the internet, but rather there's multiple immune systems at work at the internet so that the end-to-end innovation adds to a much more defense in-depth resilience rather than a top-down control. And so evolution, basically, of the modern day technology just showed that as the distribution of the internet reaches more and more countries and so on, actually makes the internet more resilient, not less.
Mhm. Are there things that you're thinking about in terms of AI actually helping imagine entirely new forms of democracy? Or sort of when you think about, I don't know, in the future, what does your imagination tell us might be possible?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious about the opportunity for the democratic system itself to become much more attuned to the uncommon ground, the surprising common ground. The uncommon ground was something that people recognize as newsworthy. Indeed, it is a headline. If the adversaries in either international politics or in domestic politics do agree to do something together, this is usually headline news. So people do recognize that these things are valuable to have. The problem was that previously, the reliable way to get people to agree on the uncommon ground, for example, previously, we know citizens' assemblies work. If you randomly select 400 people out of a million's population and put them in tables of 10 and have real conversations listening to one another, and then weave together their best arguments and then vote at the end of it, actually, most people see that despite their partisan differences and ideological differences, they do agree on most of the things most of the time with their neighbors because they had time to nuance through their different positions and lived experiences. Recently, Google Jigsaw worked with the Napolitan Institute on the We the People to 50 experiments. And it turns out 2,000 people, statistically a microcosm of the US population, five from each congressional district, 97% of them agree on how good values should start at home. Parents have the most important job of teaching children respect and kindness, and therefore, 96% of people say people should be judged by their character and action, not by appearance and backgrounds. And then it leads to how a strong society should be built. So almost if you read the consensus that is reached at the table, you would naturally think, okay, the US is not polarized at all. People have a very clear vision of
Sounds
how
great.
to construct a nation together and how to get there, right? And so there's no doubt that this effect exists and lingers in the people who are part of that conversation. Fishkin's lab tracked, for example, 1 year after such an America in one room conversation, people still think back and stay depolarized. However, previously there was no easy way for people to enjoy this kind of conversation at scale.
Mhm.
And also, even if they do enjoy such a conversation, for people who were not part of this conversation, it's easy then to paint the 400 people or the 2,000 people there as somewhat an outlier because in their mental model, it's us versus them. The repolarization effect is very strong. But now, I think for the first time, we have good enough social translation. So as long as we know a little bit of where you're coming from, your personal experiences, then language models can take this entire conversation transcript of how people reached this uncommon ground and have a tailor-made conversation with you in a one-to-one fashion or one-to-few fashion and really change people's mind toward enjoying the uncommon ground. So in AI parlance, this is called super persuasion. And super persuasion is upon us. So not only AI models pass the Turing test, that is to say, people can no longer tell whether it's human or robot, but rather changing people's political beliefs to the better in this case, or overcoming conspiracy theories. Now we do have open source tools like the Habermas machine that are super persuasive. So I think it is now upon us, all the democratic citizens, how are we going to use this super persuasive technology? Because if we do not use it to build the uncommon grounds, 100% sure the organized fraud, the polarizers, the propagandists, and so on are going to use those super persuasion tools, whether we collectively say stop or not. So we really have no choice, but rather to use this to weave the social fabric back.
I'm also hearing, though, going back to the basics of person to person civic engagement as a way of trying to build from the ground up the connection between people within a society rather than the existing information infrastructure that we currently have, which is very sort of top down in some ways with gatekeeping and media environments and information environments, but then also these kind of bizarre pockets online that have bred all kinds of wild communities that have really shared perspective on the world in a way that gives them a sense of
Hmm.
bonding, but also maybe what they're learning and knowing is just not true or is sort of driving them towards something that is really politically harmful to them and to probably the people around them. So essentially, what I'm hearing you say is that more organic conversation between people that is structured in a way that allows them to see each other as people and encourages individuals to actually listen as part of a process and get to know people is like an essential rebuilding almost of how we think about citizenry.
Yeah, definitely. I think for most people, the in-person context is already centered around communities.
Mhm.
It is only when you go online, then somehow you're no longer a community member,
Yeah.
right? You're just a user, as in a drug user, and addicted, atomized
Yeah.
individual
Placeless.
being the placeless, being optimized for individual level engagement while obscuring the civic context that give anything meaning really and enable collective action, right? So I think I like your framing of going back to the roots because a communitarian alternative to tech would treat communities, either in person or distributed, as first class entities. So, not just detecting the communities and push advertisement to those cohorts, but rather to make the community connection legible to citizens, to design for the coherence among communities and within communities, and also making sure that this coherence or the uncommon ground is something that people are willing to pay for. Because in person, people fund together to build temples, mosques, church, and so on, not just because they admire the architecture, but rather this is essential community infrastructure for people to come together. That is precisely what people are paying for. And this is not because they have a transactional nature with each other, but because they feel collective action is what gives life meaning. And we don't have that sort of things in the online AI world now. I mean, ChatGPT have group chat, like it's a beginning, but there's far more to be done.
It's really interesting. I also feel like what you're describing would be very helpful for a lot of the mental health issues that have come about because of extensive engagement in online spaces. And like I'm thinking about a lot of people are lonely not just because they spend a lot of time online, it's because they're not spending a lot of time in person with other people. And I feel like it's because there's not physical spaces to do that. There's not incentives to do that. There's not support structures to do that. And we're losing the ability, I think, also to be with other people. And we don't have the reasons to the extent maybe we used to.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the remaining civic ties, where people are still enjoying the buzz of collective action and sense making, you see like sports, food, spirituality. And my guess is not that they're like inherently more communal than the other activities. It was just that it's harder to digitize than such activities. So the activities that are easily digitized got digitized and then people lose those community bonds. But it's not inherent in any of the communities. Even if it's already digitized, we can, in those digital spaces, replicate or even amplify the same kind of buzz, the same kind of community feeling as people are currently enjoying in food and drink, in sports, in
Mhm.
fashion, and in spiritual connections.
You're also making me think back to that point you made at the beginning about how things that are measured can be fixed. Like I was thinking as you're listing those examples of sports or the different experiences that people still go to find that campfire moment where you're with other people. In politics or in civic engagement, a lot of times it's campaigns. And I feel like there's this rush where people feel connected to something or a process where there's an endpoint where you know if you won or not. And I think
Mhm,
it's
mhm,
we then struggle to sustain that level of energy. So I'm thinking about like
mhm.
Mamdani's campaign. I'm really crossing my fingers that in the process of him building his way of governing and his process of governing, that he's able to be as inclusive as he was in the process of campaigning, which I actually have a lot of confidence he will be able to. But I feel like that has oftentimes been a big problem that there's this drop off in between events that are measurable and quantifiable. There's a team sport kind of feeling and then at the end, there's not as much to sustain the connection that you have.
Yes, I think we can align AI systems and we can align governance system. We can also have eval that are crowdsourced for a mayor's policies, and then you can kind of win the score once you reach a uncommon ground, and then the mayor has to either adopt your uncommon ground ideas or propose something even better. Again, this is the usual dynamic between the legislative branch and the executive branch. But I think now the plural sector, for the first time, have a way that has both the rigor and the ease of execution as the individual to individual polling and the kind of fun vibe of online culture sharing spaces like short form video, right? So it used to be that these two do not come together unless it's the month before the voting, in which it comes together,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I think our challenge is now with this super persuasive Habermas machine coordinated cooperative AI systems, multi-agent chat systems, can we actually weave this together so that people see, oh, actually, it's as easy as this kind of social sharing, but then the output is as rigorous as any poll. And in fact, you can validate it with a traditional poll to show that, oh, people actually, after they went through this kind of fun process, it actually does produce fair results and in a very fast way that we can get the rest of the population to see through this individual to individual super persuasive reiteration, the social translation of the uncommon ground, then that becomes a new mandate, right? So it doesn't even need to be a ballot initiative, although it can lead to one.
Super interesting. Okay, well, my last question is less a question and more an invitation. That if there are people who represent governments or who are policymakers that are coming to the summit, or maybe thinking in fresh ways about how they should be considering AI within democracy in their portfolios or in their departments, or sort of however they come to the democratic process, what do you want them to be thinking about? And are there any examples from your time as digital minister that you want to relay to inspire them to think differently about the way that technology might enhance the democratic experience for the people that they govern?
The key question for any government is, are you putting your citizens into the loop of colonial AI? Or are you taking it back and putting those AI systems in the loop of your citizenry? Treating AI as a infrastructure for human coordination is more fast, fair, and fun than the colonial alternative. This is the first frame that I like people to think. And in Taiwan, we do not talk about future extinction risk or something. We talk about the organized fraud that people are experiencing right now here. And instead of saying, let's make a kind of universal top down rule to enumerate the AI risk or whatever, we say, oh, let's use AI systems to help people cohere and agree in the here and now very quickly against deepfake, synthetic intimacy, fraud, and many other like current day issues. And so after we came together last March in such a online alignment assembly, the legal drafts are published in May and everything is passed in July. And so throughout this year, for the whole year in Taiwan, there's just no deepfake ads anymore on social media because the people have drawn the red line together on a arguably a large fire, actually. But when the large fire happens, we did not just say, that's the price of progress. We didn't say that. But rather, we say, oh, let's light some campfire, also using AI. It's also fire. But those campfire brings people together. They agree to draw the red lines to put a firewall against the synthetic fraud fire of those social media companies. And now we coexist just fine with synthetic media on advertisement because these are very useful. People are going to use that for short clips and things like that, but it does not lead to organized fraud in Taiwan. So this is just one anecdote. We did many other things, including with the organic coronavirus. However, I think this suffices as an anecdote to say, the sooner you light this local civic AI as campfire, the less you need to tell your citizen, oh, you have to suffer some stifling innovation because of some future danger, because it's a very difficult political case to make. But the local campfire, that also helps your next re-election as well.
Thanks again to Audrey for joining me for this conversation. As a reminder, this episode is part of a series we're doing in partnership with AI Now and the Aapti Institute called Reframing Impact, AI Summit 2026. We've got interviews with some incredible guests, and you can find the full series on our channel. So do go check that out. And thanks so much for joining.